Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you here today. Like many of you, I come from a wine-growing family. In this case, this is a picture of my parents' vineyard in the hills above the town of Sonoma, about an hour north of San Francisco. I'm far from home now in Sweden, but wine is still very close to my heart. It inspired my research in looking at the impacts of climate change on the wine industry, and especially what we can do to actually fix this problem. To quickly sum up the state of the latest science on climate change, it can fit on one piece of paper, which I've used to guide my teaching for many years and made it into a footnoted protest sign recently. What the science tells us is it's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad, and we can fix it. We know that human activities, mostly burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas to heat our homes, fly our planes, drive our cars, along with livestock in particular, as part of agriculture, is what's driving the climate change we're seeing now. We know that it's already warmed about 1 degree, and that if we don't change, we can expect much more warming in the future. We know that the consequences are really bad and serious, and something that often gets lost is that we are at a fundamental decision point for humanity. We're the ones who are going to decide what the future is that we live through and every human who will follow us will experience. Excuse me. So one way that climate change is bad is that it threatens the growing of high-quality wine. It threatens where we can grow wine, traditional growing regions, both yields and quality. If this isn't scary enough, it also threatens food production and life on Earth. So we have a lot of reasons to be concerned, but here we'll focus on the wine. Summarizing some work that many colleagues and I have done for many years, we can say that climate change in wine, like so many natural systems, disrupts fundamental processes. So the places where we've chosen to grow wine are well adapted to the varieties that we've grown there. And in the ideal conditions, the grape is ripening at the perfect speed, balancing the accumulation of sugars with the loss of acid. There's time for the flavor precursors that will end up giving the wine much of its character to develop, color as well. What climate change is doing is disrupting these processes. It's decoupling them, and they're happening at different times. So sugar and ripening is happening faster. This means that we would like to pick earlier for the right sugar-acid balance. But we may not yet have achieved the flavor and the color that we want in the wines. This makes wine growing much more difficult. Of course, we know great wine starts in the vineyard, and it's much easier to make a great wine out of grapes that have grown in the right climate. So there are many things that we can do in the winery and in the vineyard to adapt to the changes that we've seen already. I think it's really important to keep in mind what we're trying to do with adaptation is manage the changes that we can't avoid. The 1 degree of warming we've already experienced and the some amount of warming that we expect to be locked in the future. But what's really critical is that we avoid the changes that we can't manage. That's what we're talking about with mitigation, actually tackling the root of the problem and preventing further climate change. So what are some options for adaptation? Well, in the vineyard and in the winery, there are many. The bigger the changes and the more expensive tend to have the bigger effects. So simple things like acid addition in the wine may help to balance some of the chemical composition. More fundamental changes like how we manage our vineyards and thinking about changing varieties or trellising has a bigger effect. Sometimes we hear a lot about moving viticulture and changing the location where we're growing wine. And I want to point out, I don't see this as a viable or sustainable adaptation strategy. When we think about sustainability, all the needs that humans have for land, we need to grow enough food, we need to provide shelter and habitat for other living species to sequester the carbon that we need to be taking out of the atmosphere and natural ecosystems. We can't expect to find uninhabited continents somewhere further north that are going to house our vineyards in the future. We need to figure out how to make wine growing work primarily in the places where we're already doing so. One way that we've identified it would be by better using the existing natural diversity that's been cultivated over hundreds, and in some cases thousands of years by our predecessors. We know that there are thousands of varieties of grapes, but today our research has shown only about 12 varieties are responsible for more than 80% of the global market. This means that we're really limiting our adaptation option because we're so homogenized and so specialized, especially in these new world areas where the red circles mean the varieties grown there are primarily these 12 international varieties. Further diversification, for example, looking here at our hosts in Portugal, the larger circles mean more varieties are grown here, and the lighter colors mean they're more diverse and less common varieties. We need to be investigating these as possibilities to adapt to a changing climate. Another reason this is important that we better use diversity is shown here by comparing two qualities important for adapting to climate, which is the timing of ripening and water use efficiency. The pink graph shows the average for the 12 international varieties, and the blue shows the values for about 100 more diverse varieties. What we see is that there's a much greater range of potential ripening times, which could be better adapted to climate, and a much higher potential water use efficiency, which obviously could be a big advantage in a drier climate. So these are varieties that I think we should be investigating. But again, I want to emphasize, remember, we're trying to manage the changes we can't avoid and avoid the changes we can't manage. And the choice that we face today is really between two different worlds. We talk about it as if it's abstract and far in the future. I expect to live long enough to see which of these worlds we're creating. One of them is where we actually act today and take the steps necessary to get off this pathway of high emissions, where we actually do what we need to fix the problem. In that world, I think there's a strong future for wine growing. This map shows the temperature change projected in a world with much lower emissions than we have today, and I think this is an amount of change that we can expect to cope with. In a 4-degree or warmer world, which is what we're headed for if we don't change, if we continue high emissions, I really think it's unreasonable to expect that the wine industry could continue. A 4-degree warmer world is a planet that we would not recognize. There are lots of scientific citations I could quote, but I think it's hard to put into words what a fundamentally different planet this would be. I don't think that a 4-degree warmer world is compatible with a civilized society or democracy. It's certainly not one where wine growing is going to be our primary concern. So we simply have to do what it takes to fix it. Here's a way of visualizing it. The latest science from a major report that came out in October says, basically, we're much closer to much bigger and scarier risks from climate change than we thought. We used to think of a 2-degree warming as safe. What the latest science shows us, now that we've already experienced even a bit more than 1-degree warming, is that that's not true. The closer we get to more warming, the more risks we face to people, to ecosystems, to societies, to economies. And basically, this puts a real urgency on us to protect vulnerable systems like coral reefs, which even under 2 degrees of warming, we can't expect to have anymore. So we're really making a fundamental choice between a living world that we inhabit and pass on, and condemning ourselves and future generations to this slime world, which is certainly not a world I want to live in. So that's why I'm going to spend the rest of my time articulating what I think the wine industry can and should do to really tackle this problem, to be a real climate leader, which I think is a unique opportunity for the wine industry. I think this vision has 3 steps. One is supporting science-based targets for treating our carbon budget seriously, and the wine industry doing its share to commit to limiting global warming to below 1.5 degrees. The second is aiming for 0 greenhouse gas emissions across the whole value chain. And the third is using the unique position of the industry, both to lead innovation within the industry and to set the tone for what a low-carbon high life looks like, how we can have a continued high quality of life with radically lower emissions. So first, looking at supporting these targets. There we go. We have used up, those of us alive today, most of it has been during my lifetime in the last 40 years, have used up almost all of humanity's carbon budget. This is the amount of pollution we can safely put in the atmosphere. There's very little of it remaining. And if we take the 1.5 degree target seriously, which I think we should, we need to immediately, radically reduce our emissions. This is what climate leadership looks like. Seriously reducing emissions and aiming for 0. It has to be us, because as you can see, if we delay, we're going to be past the limit. And it has to be 0, because as long as we're adding more carbon to the atmosphere, we'll continue to drive more warming and an unstable climate. Most of this has to come from reducing emissions that exist today, and we know those come mostly from burning fossil fuels, also from agriculture, primarily from raising livestock. There is an important role for land managers to better manage land, to sequester and take up and protect soil and protect carbon in soil and ecosystems. But there's just no way around. We have to fundamentally get off of fossil fuels if we're going to tackle climate change. Secondly, I think it's critical to call ourselves climate leaders. We need to set quantitative targets and heading towards zero greenhouse gas emissions. This is really what's necessary. It's clear that there's no more room in the carbon budget to build more fossil-based infrastructure or continue to buy cars, for example, or tractors that are running on fossil fuels. That's something we simply have to stop doing now if we're serious about tackling climate change. So I suggest that the ambitious goal of being fossil-free by 2030, there are many countries that have already done this actually with their plans for electrifying their fleet, for example, and at least an 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the next 15 years. This is an ambitious target, but I think it's what's needed to call ourselves leaders, and I would love to see the Porto Protocol actually adopt these targets. Getting to an 85% reduction, we can think of it as 3 steps of cutting in half. We need to cut in half the first half starting now, so we don't have time, as some of the earlier speakers suggested, to peak emissions in 2040. That's committing us to dangerous climate change. Emissions have to peak today and start going down. So we need to be thinking about how to cut the first half now. The second half 5 years after that, the third half 5 years after that. There are good protocols and examples that we can follow, so there are plenty of resources to familiarize yourself and start looking at your whole value chain. It is really important that we consider not just the vineyard or the winery, but also the energy and products that we buy and the tourists we attract, and especially the business travel that we're doing. Probably the biggest part of the carbon footprint of the wine industry is our airline travel. And I'll show some data on that at the personal level, but we have to really rethink how we're using planes and fly much less if we're serious about tackling climate change. If we look at just the carbon footprint of a bottle of wine, we know that there are a couple areas that deserve our immediate focus for cutting this first half, and those are in the vineyard and in packaging. So in better managing inputs, especially nitrogen fertilizer, which both takes energy to produce and releases the greenhouse gas nitrous oxide, that's a big opportunity to reduce emissions. We also really need to look at packaging. It's a big part of the carbon footprint to have these heavy glass bottles. So looking at lightweight alternatives is a really important step. And we need to think about 100% renewable energy for wineries starting today and in decarbonizing our transport. So rather than flying or moving by truck, we need to think about how to move our products and get them to market by much lower carbon alternatives. Finally, I think the industry has an opportunity and really a responsibility to lead by example, both because of the unique position that we're in and because of the clients of the wine industry. And this is where we have to really be ambitious and set this vision for what does it look like to have a good life in a carbon-constrained world. I think in the industry side, colleagues have identified 6 key areas for climate leadership. This is really important to take a look at and have an overall view for how are we going to decarbonize, what role can industries play. And one thing that's very important to look at here is investments, where we put our own finances, the value we're offering to investors. If we take climate change seriously, we have to be decarbonizing to continue to have value and to count on increasing value in a warming world. Finally, we have to look at our customers and our lifestyles. One reason that the wine industry, I think, is going to be critical for solving climate change is that wine drinkers are key in producing climate emissions. It's only about 10% of us on Earth who have $1,000 or more per month to live on. I think people below that income level are not buying and drinking a lot of fine wine. And those of us who are fortunate to be in this level are responsible for most of the climate pollution that we have today. So we can have excellent, comfortable, exciting lifestyles that still have adventure, where we still exchange ideas and share across borders, but with much lower emissions and maintaining a good quality of life. And this is seen here by a very high-income household where their carbon footprint is completely dominated by flying. Even though flying is globally rare, for those of us who do, it's absolutely the largest part of our carbon footprint. You can see that for this household of 2 people, they're about 3 times higher per person than the current US average, about 10 times higher than the current global average. The sustainable average per person of carbon emissions is 2.5 tons per year. So look at where this line is compared to where this household is today. This is the scope of our challenge. And we need to be thinking creatively about how we have wonderful, exciting lives on radically less emissions. And there's just no way around it that we have to be flying less. Looking at living car-free is the best option in reducing mobility emissions. Electric cars cut about half of the climate pollution, according to our research. A plant-based diet is the highest impact action as individuals that we can take to reduce our consumption emissions. But we have to be thinking about how can we have a model for our industry and for our wine drinkers now and in the future. What does this lifestyle look like in a way that's appealing and exciting and maximizes meaning but minimizes carbon? So I'd like to close there and say I really believe that the wine industry can be critical in leading the way to a safe climate future, both because of the creativity and the necessity that we have to adapt, to maintain and preserve our existing vineyards to the changes that we can't avoid, but in really getting serious about quantitative targets starting now to reduce emissions to avoid the changes we can't manage. And this means committing to targets compatible with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That means aiming for 0 emissions and doing so really fast, going fossil-free and cutting emissions in half starting today. I think these are going to be really critical steps that the wine industry is uniquely positioned to take, and I hope that you will choose to take them yourselves in your own personal lives, as I have, and already cutting my first 50% of emissions. I can say it's led to a much better quality of life, and taking the train here was a lovely journey from Sweden, and also sets an example and can inspire others. I think we have a lot of work to do, and I look forward to doing it together. Thank you very much.